Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for coming along today. I'd like to start by acknowledging the Turrbal and Yagara traditional owners and their custodianship of the lands which we're meeting and working on, and pay my respects to their ancestors and their descendants. So last week, Claudia gave you a talk about environmental social science, focusing on communities. And this week, I thought that I would focus more on individual behaviours. So I know a lot of you are interested in environmental stewardship and how we can foster greater uptake of these environmental behaviours. Now, I've been told I need to give you a bit of information about my background to start with. So I started my research career on the Great Barrier Reef a very long time ago, back in the mid-90s, after which I moved to New Zealand and worked for some of the Crown Research Institutes and universities over there. We came back to Australia about 15 years later when I decided to do my PhD, which I completed in 2016. And since then, I've been very fortunate to do a postdoc over in the US at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology and worked with some other research institutes there, as well as collaborating with some marine scientists in Chile. So all of these projects have had me looking at human dimensions of environmental issues, and they've almost all been interdisciplinary teams that I've worked with. So there's too many projects to list all of them, but they fall into three general categories. Particularly, a lot of the earlier work was looking at natural and protected area management, so coral reefs to geothermal vegetations, national parks, that sort of thing. I then moved into a lot of climate change research with the Emissions and Biodiversity Exchange Project, that led into other work on energy efficiency and waste production, as well as some work on marine debris. So all of those experiences got me interested in how we communicate about the science behind a lot of our environmental issues. And so I did a PhD in marine science communication, and I was really looking at participatory approaches to engaging the general public. And that's what led to my interest in citizen science as well. So now I'm here at, this is not working. Here we are at UQ, and I'm working on the new Sustainable Urban Seascapes project with Carissa Klein, Kathy Lovelock and John Pandolfi and others, and very much looking forward to contributing to that project. Before I launch into the talk, I wanted to explain briefly what social science is and rather what it isn't as well. So we classify a lot of the social sciences into two categories, either the classical social sciences such as psychology and economics and that sort of thing, or applied social sciences like education and communication. And the approach we take in social science tend to be described as empirical, rational, objective. So in many ways, we're very similar to the natural sciences. Now, this is in contrast to the humanities, which provide really valuable insights into lots of environmental issues, but they tend to be more of an interpretive type of field. So the tools I commonly use in my research are surveys and interviews, amongst other methods. And the area that I tend to focus on, certainly more in recent years, is understanding human behaviour and behaviour change, as well as communication. So just as there are many different types of natural scientists, there are many different types of social sciences as well. So don't get me to do an economics study for you, because I'm not going to be able to help you with that. Right, so the title of today's talk is Understanding Human Behaviours to Foster Environmental Stewardship. And Nathan Bennett and his colleagues have provided a framework to help us understand environmental stewardship, what it is and what it takes to to generate those sorts of behaviours. But we can also consider more deeply the human behaviour that leads to environmental behaviours. So there's a very long history of behavioural research in social psychology that we can draw from. It's really been in the more recent decades that there's been a lot more focus on environmental behaviours though. And what we want to do is look at what the barriers are to some of these behaviours, but also the drivers, so what motivates people to get involved. And we can generally categorise these barriers and drivers into two different types of factors. So we want to consider the internal or personal factors, so people's motivations, their affect, which is just a psychological term for their emotions and feelings, things like habits as well, or attitudes. And then there's external factors to consider. So perhaps there are some sort of structural changes that need to happen to foster particular behaviours. Now, understanding these barriers and drivers are really essential for behaviour change interventions to be successful. What we've learned along the way is, unfortunately, that education or information on its own is simply not enough to change people's behaviours. And I want to illustrate this with some of the littering education that we see around. Now, currently, the New South Wales government has images and text online and in various places, trying to discourage people from littering. So that image on the left says each year over 25,000 tonnes of litter is tossed in New South Wales. So pretty shocking statistics, right? And on the right, we see an image of someone littering, and then underneath that image, they had a list of different facts about litter. So these messages are trying to shock us into action. Likewise, a more creative way of trying to encourage anti-littering behaviour was this see-through poster on a bus stop. So what they did here is they collected the rubbish each day around this particular bus stop and then put it into the see-through poster there. And at the bottom it says, this is how much rubbish we've collected around this bus stop since Monday. So as you can see in each panel, the amount of litter grows and grows. So in theory, we should be so shocked by this awful littering problem that we do something about it. Unfortunately, the evidence says that this is not what happens at all. In fact, what we're seeing here is unintended signals that littering here in these environments is the social norm. So what we might want to consider instead is demonstrating the correct behaviour rather than sending messages that everybody else litters here too. Now, other studies on littering behaviours have shown that when litter is present, people are much more likely to litter than when they're in a completely clean area. So we want to be careful about sort of messages that we may unintentionally be giving people. Okay, so I'm going to talk about 3 case studies of research that I've been involved with that tries to understand some of these drivers of particular environmental stewardship behaviours. We'll look at a couple of citizen science projects and a study on bird feeding. So the marine stewardship example here was from my PhD research, where I used the case study of the REDMAP citizen science project. Now, REDMAP asks marine users across the country to report any marine species they see that is uncommon for a particular area. So it might not be a rare species, but they don't normally see that particular species in the areas they're familiar with. Now, this project is aiming to try to identify potential range shifts, climate-driven range shifts in marine species. So what I set out to do is try to understand what it would take to get more marine users involved in this project. And to do that, I conducted 110 interviews with marine users in 4 different parts of Australia, where very different things were happening with the range shifts in marine species there. Now, that qualitative work was really important for the development of a national survey, so the quantitative phase of the research. And it helped me to develop relevant questions that were in the language of the target audience, so that we could get a better handle on which were the most important factors that were going to help or hinder people getting involved in this project. Now, I'm putting our model up simply to say that these quantitative studies in social science can look very much like study analyses that you're probably familiar with. So we use structural equation modelling amongst other methods to determine things like people's intention to participate in the REDMAT project. And in a nutshell, what I found was the key barrier was people's perceived lack of knowledge, or a lack of confidence in their knowledge about marine species. They simply thought they wouldn't know enough to be able to participate, despite the fact that that's a high level of knowledge is not required for the project. Some of the motivating factors were things like they thought that they would be able to learn more about the marine environment. They were eager to contribute to scientific knowledge. But I found that groups differed in their interests in different roles within the project. So everybody was keen to collect data, but after that, different groups shared different interests in, say, data analysis for some, communication of the findings for others. And the upshot of that work was I found that people who were most likely to participate in marine citizen science already hold pro-science attitudes, so they're very favourable of science, towards science. Okay, so the implications of that work for environmental stewardship were that there really is a great potential to tap into more marine users for these sorts of projects. So there's a lot of eagerness out there. But to do that, we might need to reframe our recruitment messages for different sorts of groups, particularly if we're calling for them to come and be involved in science. We might want to consider some other messages there. It would be helpful perhaps to build their confidence in species identification if that's a requirement of the project, or at least communicate that it's not in the case of REDMAT. And we need to also consider that people who are not interested in science may need very different approaches to their engagement. So let's not put science at the forefront, let's maybe connect with some of their other values when it comes to healthy environments. Right, so I'm now going to take you on a journey. So away from Australia, we're going to go over to the US and visit the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. Now, I know a lot of you are already familiar with the lab, particularly as it's the home of the eBird Citizen Science Project or platform. Now, eBird isn't the only citizen science that the lab does. I know some of you are shocked to find out that they do other things as well. One of their projects is Project FeederWatch. Now, in this project, they ask people to identify and count the birds that come to their feeders in winter. Now, bird feeding isn't such a popular activity here in Australia. In fact, a lot of people frown upon it. But did you know that in America, it's extremely popular? More than 57 million people feed wild birds around their homes in the US. So if you think about what that means from a bird's perspective, there's this really, really wide network, not just across your neighbourhood, not just across your street, but across the whole country of supplemental food. And so it's little wonder that Daryl Jones from Griffith University calls this an unplanned ecological experiment on an unbelievably large scale. So the next case study related to environmental stewardship I want to talk about is a study we did on understanding bird feeding motivations. What we set out to do is work out how and why people feed birds, because there's surprisingly little information for such a big, a popular activity, surprisingly little information in the US about the types of food people are putting out, the availability of these different types of foods across seasons, and importantly, why people are doing this. And this information is really important for us to be able to promote best practice bird feeding that reduces harm or potential harm to the feeder birds. So what we did is we set out with a survey to study two groups. One was the bird feeding public, and the other were participants of this FeederWatch project. Now, thankfully, the US Fish and Wildlife Service, US Fish and Wildlife Service do a 5-yearly survey and have done for a very long time about wildlife. So we know an awful lot about how many people are feeding birds around their homes, thanks to that survey. We know a lot about all the socio-demographic characteristics of the general public who feed birds. So we were able to, as best as we could, match a sample of that population in our survey, and then run the same survey with feeder watchers. So we've got just over 1,000 in each group. We can see that our feeder watchers are a much older group than the general population who feed birds. It's predominantly a female activity. Our feeder watchers are very, very white. They're highly educated. And interestingly, the most common types of foods that are being put out for birds are very different for the two groups. So economy seed mix for the national group, and suet, which is a mixture of fat, seeds, nuts and fruits for the feeder watchers. Okay, so to work out what their motivations are, we drew from Stephen Kellett's work on wildlife values. And then we also went through the literature to find out what other studies had found about bird feeding motivations, including Rich Fuller's work back in the UK. And this provided us with a really comprehensive list of possible motivations. Now, Kellett's framework uses quite jargonish labels for each of these motivational types. So I've replaced them with a more simple explanation of what they mean. I'm happy to go through these in more detail for anyone. We can talk about this later. But what we found was that the most important motivation for both groups ended up being these personal benefits that people get from feeding wild birds. So they talk about joy, relaxation, happiness, that sort of thing. For the now the second strongest motivation for the Project FeederWatch people was the, oh sorry, I've got the colours around the wrong way at the top there, I think. Sorry, Project FeederWatch is in blue, the national survey is in green. So the second most important motivation for feeder watchers was to study, record and learn about birds, which shouldn't be too much of a surprise for a citizen science focused group. The second most important motivation for our national survey group, though, was to support and care for birds. This was also the third most important motivation for our feeder watchers. And the third most important motivation for our national group was to have a relationship with birds, to really connect with them. So what we see here is that out of the top 3 motivations for feeding wild birds, it's the personal benefits that the humans are getting that are those really strong motivators. So what this means for fostering environmental stewardship in this context is that those historical messages about helping birds, particularly through winter in some of these environments, might not be quite as important as they were for gaining attention of the audience. We might consider other messages that really connect with those personal benefits instead. So we're really, if we're trying to foster best practice bird feeding, such as, keeping your feeders clean, spreading the feeders out, trying to reduce predation from other animals and so on, perhaps it might benefit, or those programs might benefit from reframing some of the messages. Interestingly, there were some factors that were not motivating at all, such as the ecosystem services that birds provide, the inspiration for creative activities that bringing birds close in provide, and reducing food waste was not an important motivator. Now, you might think that's a bit of a funny one, that food waste one, but we found in the questions that we were asking about food provision that almost 30% of people were providing household food scraps. So there's something interesting going on there that we could explore a bit further. Right, and our final case study looks at broadening participation in Project FeederWatch. So this is something that a lot of my work at the lab focused on. Now, Project FeederWatch, as you saw before, has an interesting problem. It's largely older white women who are highly educated who are contributing to this project. And what we saw is that every year since the 90s, I think the early 90s, we had data on the average age of participants, and that the average age was going up each year. What I'm showing you here in blue is the age groups, participation rates for the age groups of the FeederWatch participants. So you can see that they're skewed in the older age. And in the green dotted line, that's our participation rates in bird feeding from the US Fish and Wildlife Survey data. So we can see there that particularly the under 50s are underrepresented in Project FeederWatch. So one of my first studies at the lab was to do a series of interviews with young adults who feed wild birds. I spoke to 72 people across the states. I really tried to understand what it would take to get them involved in the Project FeederWatch. Now, one of the surprising findings that coming out of talking to all of these people is that they said that the bird feeding groups that they encounter either online or in person are really made up of much older people. So this lovely woman here is one of our poster participants for Project FeederWatch, yet the people that I was talking to looked more like this. And they said that they felt very alone in their passion for feeding wild birds. And they wanted to connect with others around the country in their own age group to talk about bird feeding. So we set up an experimental Facebook group for them. Now, this was developed with focus groups from that younger cohort. We also involved some very talented students at the lab to create the visual look and feel of the page as well. And that gave us a bit of a captive audience to do another survey to look at what factors are really important for bringing more of these young people into the Project FeederWatch. Now, I won't go into exactly how we measure these things, but what we found essentially is that the factors that were important for these young people to get involved, basically any factor that is above that midpoint, so that grey line across at 0, were the important factors. So they said that they wanted a mobile app. At the time, Project FeederWatch was based on a piece of paper. You download your observation form, you fill it in as you go, and then enter the data in online. So they said that that's just too much. But we already knew that because even people at the lab still have years worth of data floating around on pieces of paper at home. So an app was going to be important. They wanted reminders too, because you have to leave 5 days at least between each observation period. And like almost every environmental stewardship program, people always say, you know, they need more time to do new things. Right, so the implications for stewardship is that if we want to engage new types of audiences that we're not already engaging particularly well, we might need to think about maybe different types of messages and possibly even changes to our project design to accommodate their needs and their interests. It's really important too to signal that there's other people like them in these sorts of projects. Now, the US National Park Service has been doing this a lot with African American communities too, because they found that was a really big barrier for increasing visitation by African Americans in national parks. So they've got a much stronger focus on including African Americans' stories and images in promoting national parks now. And we might need to consider new ways of collecting data. So this app, for example, might help cover several of those barriers. So not just making it quicker and easier, but we can also help overcome issues related to species identification. So in some other research we did at the lab, we found that like the RedMap project, people's confidence in their ability to identify species can be a very big barrier to their participation in species-based citizen science as well. Okay, so in conclusion, I'm hoping that you're seeing now that if we really want to engage people in environmental stewardship, we have to start by understanding who we're targeting really well. What are their needs and their interests? Co-designing projects and programs now is becoming more popular. There's certainly a greater deal of interest in co-design, and that in theory should help sustain these sorts of programs and these behaviours that we're trying to change. Doing social scientific research well is really challenging. Now, this is particularly when you're trying to target people who are not already doing the things that you want them to do. But we're also being challenged more and more now by, say, our online surveys are fraught with issues that we need to consider, like survey fraud, bots taking our surveys, all sorts of things. We've just recently published a paper about online surveys in conservation biology to try and help people with that. So yeah, there's a great deal of challenges in collecting appropriate data and doing it well. And finally, it's super important to avoid assumptions about what will work. So there really is a lot of value in collaborating with social scientists from the outset. And I'll just quickly tell you a story about a marine biologist that commented at, in one of my PhD presentations. And he was all sort of huffy and puffy. He said, "Oh, but I've tried citizen science and no one turned up." So I hope that makes the point that if we understand our audiences really well, we're going to have a much better chance of being successful with our project. Okay, a quick thank you at the end with this image of a blue whale that I saw off the coast of Chile. I never thought in my wildest dreams that I'd ever get a chance to see one of these things, just like I never thought I'd get a chance to work with CBCS. So I'm super, super happy to be here and happy to answer any questions that you've got. Thanks for your time.